Welcome to Mindful Moments. All right, let's imagine for a second. Imagine all the walls around you, just gone. Every single obstacle, every rule just vanished. Would you suddenly feel free? I mean, would you just flip a switch and boom, you're free?
That's a really interesting question, and it's one that a lot of thinkers throughout history have wrestled with.
Right. And we're going to tackle it head on in this deep dive. We're going to dig into some really fascinating sources to explore this whole idea of freedom.
Exactly. We'll look at personal stories, historical events, even some deep philosophical ideas about what it means to be free.
And we're going to challenge some conventional wisdom along the way.
Oh, absolutely. We'll push you to think beyond those easy answers.
So are you ready to get started?
Let's dive in.
All right. So let's kick things off with a powerful example. Think about Maria in Ukraine.
Okay, yeah.
The fighting stopped in her village. The immediate threat of violence is gone. Huge relief, right?
Of course. It's
No.
a massive weight lifted.
But here's the thing, is that all freedom is just the absence of danger.
Yeah,
Is that the end of the story?
that's where things get interesting. Because your sources suggest there's a whole lot more to it.
So much more. I mean, think about it. When people in Ukraine who have lived through the horrors of war are asked about freedom, they don't just talk about freedom from Russia.
Right. They talk about something much deeper.
They talk about a world opening up for them, about possibilities for the future, about their kids, about fulfilling their own purposes.
So it's not just about what they're free from. It's about what they're free to do, to become.
Exactly. It's about potential. It's about moving forward.
One person put it this way. When we say freedom, we do not mean freedom from something.
Powerful, right?
Another one defined victory as being for something, not against something.
And these aren't just abstract ideas. I mean, we hear stories about a veteran who just wants to see his son smile again.
Or a young soldier who dreams of having a family someday.
It's about hope. It's about building a future.
And that's a key insight from your sources. Freedom isn't just a passive state, it's an active force.
It's about having a purpose and striving for it.
And this leads us to a really important distinction. We often hear about this concept of negative freedom.
Right, which is basically just the absence of constraints. No one's stopping you from doing something.
But your sources challenge us to go beyond that.
They argue that true freedom isn't just about what's not there.
It's about what is there. It's about having the capacity to act, to make choices based on your values.
It's about shaping the world around you. It's not just about removing barriers. It's about actually building something.
Now, one source makes a really interesting point about this whole idea of negative freedom. It says that assuming freedom automatically fills the void when you remove obstacles is actually kind of naive.
Naive.
Yeah, like it's not the default setting that we just revert to. It takes more than that.
So it's not just a matter of taking something away.
Right. It's about what we choose to do with that newfound space, that newfound potential.
And it's not just about individual action either. There's this quote from Y.F. Mabratu that I found really powerful. He says, they talk about the country, we talk about the people.
Meaning?
Meaning that freedom isn't some abstract concept that applies to a whole nation. It's something that has to be lived and experienced by individuals.
And it has to be embodied. It has to be put into practice.
Exactly. And if we just wait for someone else to give us freedom, we never actually learn what it takes to be free.
We never develop those crucial skills, those habits of mind that allow us to exercise our freedom in a meaningful way.
Right. And this leads us to another important point from the sources. They argue that this idea of negative freedom, just being left alone, has often been championed by those who benefit from the status quo.
Interesting. Who are we talking about here?
Well, think about historical periods where people profited from exploiting others.
Okay, I see. Like slave owners.
Exactly. Or those who upheld systems of inequality. For them, freedom meant keeping the government out of their business.
So they could continue to do what they were doing without interference.
Right. And they saw any attempt to regulate their behavior or challenge their power as an infringement on their freedom.
So even a symbol like the Liberty Bell, as powerful as it is,
it doesn't really address the question of what freedom actually means or who it applies to.
it leaves out a huge part of the story.
It does. So if freedom isn't just about what's not there, then what is it?
Well, your sources introduce this really interesting concept called positive freedom.
Positive freedom.
Yeah. Think of it as the capacity to act, to make choices based on your values. It's about having the power to shape your own life and the world around you.
So it's not just about the absence of constraints. It's about the presence of something else.
Exactly. It's about having agency. It's about being able to bring about what you believe is good.
And one source brings this idea to life through a really personal story.
Oh, right. Your own family history.
Yeah. My family has this deep connection to this farm in Ohio. It's been in the family for generations, going back to the War of 1812.
Wow. That's incredible.
And we have the physical deed, a certificate marking a century of continuous ownership. It's this tangible link to the past.
And it shows how the experience of freedom and its fragility has played out across the timeline of your family's history.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is how that awareness of history, of the struggles for freedom that came before me, intertwined with my own intellectual curiosity from a very young age.
So you were reading about things like martial law in Poland as a kid.
Yeah. And the constant threat of nuclear war. It wasn't just abstract news to me. It was shaping my understanding of what it meant for freedom to be absent.
You were seeing the contrast between the gray of oppression and the red ink of resistance.
Exactly. And that awareness just kept growing. I remember reading Anne Frank's diary as a child and being deeply affected by it.
I can imagine.
Then you have the anxieties of the 1980s, the fear of nuclear war, the imagining of all these catastrophic scenarios.
So it was this constant awareness that freedom is not something to be taken for granted.
Not at all. It's something precious, something that can be easily lost.
And your experiences in Moscow during the fall of the Soviet Union offer another really interesting perspective on this.
Oh, yeah. That was a pivotal moment for me.
It was a time of immense change, and you got to see firsthand the gap between American ideals of efficiency and the messy reality of a society undergoing such a profound transformation.
It was eye-opening. I remember having these long discussions with Soviet scholars about their planned economy.
Trying to understand how it all worked and how they were going to transition to a market economy.
Right. And it became clear to me that there were no easy answers, no off-the-shelf solutions to the challenges they faced.
And you even wrote about your time in Moscow in a chapter of your book, Thinking in Public?
Yeah. That was where I started to really think about this concept of positive freedom.
So how did that come about?
Well, I was struck by how much emphasis was being placed on simply removing the constraints of the old Soviet system.
Okay, like getting rid of the centralized planning, the state control of the economy.
Exactly. And I started to wonder if that was enough. I mean, what happens when you remove those constraints? What fills the void?
Does freedom just automatically emerge?
That's the question. And I started to think that maybe it's not that simple. Maybe it takes more than just taking something away.
Maybe it requires a more active approach.
Right. And this is where the concept of positive freedom comes in. It's not just about the absence of external constraints. It's about having the capacity to act, to make choices, to build something new.
So it's about having a vision for the future and the means to pursue it.
Exactly. And this is where history becomes really important.
Okay. How so?
Well, I was studying the history of Russia, particularly the period leading up to the revolution.
So the late 19th, early 20th century?
Right. And I became fascinated by these debates that were happening among Russian intellectuals at the time.
What kind of debates?
Well, they were arguing about what kind of society Russia should become after the Tsar was overthrown.
So they were thinking about the future.
They were. And some of them, like the anarchists, believed that the best way to achieve freedom was to abolish all forms of government.
Okay, just get rid of the state altogether.
But others, like the socialists, argued that true freedom required a strong state that could provide for the basic needs of its citizens.
Interesting. So two very different visions of what a free society would look like.
And I started to think about those debates in the context of what I was seeing in Moscow.
What did you notice?
Well, I was seeing a lot of enthusiasm for the idea of simply getting rid of the old Soviet system.
Okay, just tear it all down and start over.
Right. But I was also seeing a lot of uncertainty about what would come next.
People didn't necessarily have a clear vision for the future.
Not really. And I started to worry that this lack of a positive vision, a clear sense of what they were striving for, could actually undermine the transition to a truly free society.
Interesting. How so?
Well, I was concerned that without a clear goal in mind, without a shared sense of purpose, the transition could easily go off track.
It could devolve into chaos or lead to the emergence of new forms of oppression.
Exactly. And I started to see parallels between the debates among those Russian intellectuals a century earlier and the challenges facing post-Soviet Russia.
So you're saying that history can offer us valuable lessons for understanding the challenges of freedom in the present?
I think it can. And it can also remind us that freedom is not something that's given to us. It's something that we have to actively fight for and build.
And it requires a positive vision, a clear sense of what we're striving for.
Exactly. And this brings us to another crucial aspect of positive freedom, the idea of solidarity.
Solidarity.
Yeah, the idea that we can't achieve true freedom on our own. We need each other. We need to work together to build a more just and equitable society.
And this is something that's been emphasized by a lot of different thinkers and activists throughout history.
Absolutely. From the labor movement to the civil rights movement to the fight for democracy around the world, solidarity has always been a powerful force for change.
And it's something that's particularly relevant in the face of the challenges we're facing today.
Like what?
Well, we're living in a time of increasing inequality, political polarization, and environmental crisis.
Right. And these are challenges that we can't solve on our own.
We need to come together to build bridges, to find common ground.
And this is where positive freedom can offer us a powerful framework for action.
How so?
Well, it reminds us that freedom is not just about individual rights and liberties. It's also about our responsibilities to each other.
It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to flourish.
Exactly. And that requires solidarity. It requires recognizing that our fates are intertwined.
So how do we cultivate this sense of solidarity? How do we build those bridges and find that common ground?
Well, it starts with recognizing that we're all in this together. We need to see each other not as rivals or enemies, but as fellow human beings who share a common destiny.
It's about empathy, about understanding where others are coming from.
And it's about being willing to listen to each other, even when we disagree.
Because even in our disagreements, we can often find common ground.
We can. And it's from that common ground that we can start to build a more just and equitable world.
A world where everyone has the opportunity to be truly free.
Now, there's one more really important concept that your sources highlight, and that's the idea of the Leib.
Leib.
Yeah. It's a German word that essentially means living body.
Okay.
And it's contrasted with the word Körper, which simply means body in a more physical sense.
So Leib is something more than just the physical body.
Exactly. It's the body as a subject, the body as a site of experience.
So it's about recognizing that we're not just objects in the world. We're subjects who experience the world from our own unique perspectives.
Precisely. And this is where the idea of empathy comes in again.
Okay. How so?
Well, the source argues that we can only truly understand another person if we see them as a Leib, as a subject with their own inner world.
Not just as a body that occupies space.
Right. And this requires a certain kind of attentiveness, a willingness to step outside of our own perspective and try to see the world through another person's eyes.
And that's not always easy to do.
It's not. But it's absolutely essential for building a more just and compassionate world.
Because when we fail to see others as Leib, we dehumanize them.
And that can have dangerous consequences.
It can lead to violence, to oppression, to all sorts of injustice.
So recognizing the Leib is not just a philosophical exercise. It's a moral imperative.
It's the foundation of a truly ethical way of being in the world.
And this idea of the Leib is also closely connected to the concept of positive freedom.
How so?
Well, the source argues that we can only truly be free if we recognize our own Leib, our own subjectivity.
If we understand ourselves as agents in the world, as beings who have the capacity to act and make choices.
Exactly. And that recognition has to be cultivated. It has to be nurtured.
So freedom is not something that we're just given. It's something that we have to work towards.
We do. And that work starts with paying attention to our own inner world, to our own thoughts and feelings.
It's about developing self-awareness, about understanding what motivates us, what makes us tick.
And it's about cultivating our capacity for empathy, our ability to see the world through the eyes of others.
So positive freedom is not just about individual action. It's also about building relationships, about creating communities where everyone can flourish.
It's about recognizing our interconnectedness, our shared humanity.
And that's a really powerful message, especially in the times we're living in.
It is. Because when we feel isolated, when we feel alone, it's easy to lose hope.
It's easy to give in to despair.
But when we connect with others, when we build those bonds of solidarity, we create a force that's much greater than ourselves.
A force that can challenge injustice, that can overcome oppression, that can create a more just and equitable world.
Now, speaking of challenges, your sources also highlight a few really interesting time warps that can distort our understanding of freedom.
Time warps.
Yeah, think of them as these pervasive narratives that shape how we see the world and our place in it.
Okay. What are these time warps?
Well, one is the politics of inevitability.
Inept.
Yeah. This is the idea that history is moving in a certain direction, and there's nothing we can do to change it.
So a kind of fatalism.
Exactly. And it often goes hand in hand with a sense of complacency.
Like, why bother trying to change things if it's all predetermined anyway?
Right. And this kind of thinking can be really dangerous.
Because it can lead to apathy, to inaction.
It can. And it can also make us blind to the possibilities for change.
So what's the second time warp?
The second one is the politics of eternity.
Eternity.
Yeah. This is the idea that the past is always better than the present, and that we should try to return to some mythical golden age.
So a kind of nostalgia for a time that never really existed.
Exactly. And this kind of thinking can be just as dangerous as the politics of inevitability.
How so?
Well, it can lead to a rejection of progress, to a fear of the future.
And it can also be used to justify all sorts of harmful policies.
Like what?
Well, think about the ways in which appeals to tradition have been used to justify discrimination, to uphold systems of inequality, to resist social change.
So both the politics of inevitability and the politics of eternity can be really limiting.
They can trap us in the past and prevent us from imagining a better future.
Exactly. And that brings us to the third time warp.
What's that one?
The politics of catastrophe.
Catastrophe.
Yeah. This is the idea that the world is on the brink of collapse
Yeah.
and that there's nothing we can do to stop it.
So a kind of apocalyptic thinking.
It is. And it's become increasingly prevalent in recent years.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's partly due to the very real challenges we're facing: climate change, economic inequality, political instability.
Right. Those are all very serious issues.
They are. And I think they've created a sense of anxiety, of feeling that things are spiraling out of control.
And that can lead to a kind of paralysis.
It can. Because if we believe that catastrophe is inevitable, then what's the point of even trying to change things?
So how do we resist these time warps? How do we break free from these limiting narratives?
Well, the source argues that it starts with reclaiming our sense of agency.
Our ability to act, to make a difference.
Exactly. And that requires a shift in perspective.
Okay, what kind of shift?
We need to stop seeing ourselves as passive victims of history and start seeing ourselves as active participants in shaping the future.
So it's about taking responsibility.
It is. And it's also about recognizing that the future is not predetermined.
It's something that we can create together.
And that's where solidarity comes in again.
Right, because we can't do this alone.
We can't. We need each other. We need to build movements, to organize, to demand change.
And we need to have a vision for the kind of world we want to create.
A world that's more just, more equitable, more sustainable.
A world where everyone has the opportunity to be truly free.
And that brings us to the final point I want to make. Your sources emphasize that freedom is not just a destination.
It's a journey.
It is. It's an ongoing process of struggle and growth.
It's about constantly challenging ourselves, about pushing beyond our comfort zones.
It's about learning from our mistakes and never giving up on the pursuit of a better world.
And it's about recognizing that the fight for freedom is never truly over.
It's a fight that each generation has to take up anew.
And it's a fight that's worth fighting.
Absolutely. So what can we do to keep that fight going?
Well, I think it starts with education. We need to teach our children about the history of freedom, about the struggles and sacrifices that have been made to achieve it.
And we need to teach them about the different forms that freedom can take.
Because it's not just about political freedom. It's also about economic freedom, social freedom, cultural freedom.
And it's about the freedom to think for ourselves, to question authority, to challenge the status quo.
And we need to create spaces where those freedoms can be exercised.
Spaces where people can come together, share ideas, and organize for change.
Spaces like libraries, community centers, and universities.
And we need to protect those spaces from attack.
Because they're essential for a free and democratic society.
They are. So let's commit to fighting for those spaces, for those freedoms, for that future.
Because a world without freedom is a world without hope.
And we deserve better than that.
You do. So let's get to work.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to briefly touch on Mindful Moments. For those who don't know, it's a really interesting YouTube channel that analyzes audiobooks using AI.
Oh, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, they do some really deep dives on a variety of topics.
So it's kind of like what we're doing here, but with audiobooks.
In a way, yeah. They're all about extracting insights and understanding complex ideas.
I'll have to check that out.
Definitely worth a look. Now, As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a few thoughts.
Okay, shoot.
First, remember that freedom is not a spectator sport.
It's something that we have to actively participate in.
It is. And that participation can take many forms.
From voting to volunteering to speaking out against injustice.
Every action, no matter how small, can make a difference.
And it all adds up.
It does. Second, remember that freedom is not free.
It comes at a cost.
And that cost has been paid by countless individuals throughout history.
Those who have fought for justice, for equality, for a better world.
And we owe it to them to carry on that fight.
We do. So let's honor their sacrifices by continuing to strive for a more just and equitable world.
And finally, remember that freedom is not just about rights. It's also about responsibilities.
Responsibilities to ourselves, to each other, and to the planet.
And those responsibilities are interconnected.
We can't have true freedom without justice.
We can't have true justice without equality.
And we can't have true equality without sustainability.
So let's commit to building a world where all of those things are possible.
A world where everyone has the opportunity to be truly free.
And that's where you come in. What will you do to make that world a reality? Think about it, act on it, and never stop fighting for freedom.
Well said. And for those of you listening, if you want to dive deeper into these ideas, we highly recommend Timothy Snyder's book On Tyranny. It's a brilliant and timely exploration of the fragility of freedom and the importance of resisting authoritarianism. We've included a link to purchase it in the show notes.
And as always, we encourage you to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more insightful conversations like this one. Share this episode with anyone you think might benefit from it. And most importantly, keep thinking critically, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a better world.
Until next time.